Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 579. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about mosques and palaces, ancient walls, rooftop bars, and a building that was the largest building in the world for 1,000 years, as we go to Istanbul, Turkey. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. In what may be the worst timing we have ever had on this show, we're about to do a show on one of my favorite cities in the world, which is Istanbul. And I learned just today that Turkey has cut off visas for U.S. travelers. Now, I'm hoping that will only be a temporary thing and they'll sort that all out. So we're still doing a show in Istanbul, and I hope we can all get there someday. I'd like to welcome to the show Christopher Mitchel from travelingmitch.com, who has come to talk to us about Istanbul in Turkey. Christopher, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Happy to be on here. I've loved the show for a long time, so honored to be here.
Well, and we're going to talk about some of the concerns of going to Istanbul in a bit, but first, why should somebody go to Istanbul?
For me, it's just hard to whittle it down to a few reasons because it's truly one of the world's great cities. And having lived there for 3 years, I can say I left and I still had things on my to-do list. And that's pretty special when you think about a city like that, right? Obviously, the big sell is probably the history there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you go to a city and you think, oh, this reminds me of this reminds me of that. But the truth is Istanbul just reminds you of Istanbul because it's just got such a unique place in this world in history. Obviously, you've got Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire coming over, the Byzantine Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire, all sharing a space and sometimes building on top of each other, hence the Hagia Sophia. And so for me, that's got to be it. I mean, it's the history. Other things as well, the diversity of neighborhoods is incredible. I can think of probably 7 distinct neighborhoods that are really just very different from each other. Katakoy on the Asian side and Taksim, Galata, Karakoy. We can go into those in further detail, but just off the top of my head, it's incredible. And thirdly, this is going to be my little bit lighter answer, but Turkish breakfast.
Turkish breakfast? Okay.
This is something we can talk about in
Okay.
big detail, but it's something I feel like the world needs to know about. I'm not kidding here.
I
And
love the
I'm,
food in general, but that's interesting that you chose the breakfast of the meals. Okay. All right. We'll get into that.
yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, we can go into that more later if we talk a little bit about food, but I would just say for the time being, everyone should probably write that down and head to Google. It's it's something else.
Well, and when you said that Istanbul doesn't remind you of anything, I would add to that that afterwards, a lot of things will remind you of Istanbul. So
Sure,
when you're in
definitely.
Cairo and you're looking at the Muhammad Ali Mosque, you'll go, oh, they modeled that one after Hagia Sophia. Or when you see kind of almost any Ottoman mosque or almost any Byzantine church, you'll be reminded of Hagia Sophia or Saint Saviour and Coro or something else. So there will be other things that will remind you of Istanbul after your trip to Istanbul. Yeah, one of my favorite cities in the world as well.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
What would you recommend for someone who doesn't have 3 years to visit it?
I can speak from sort of two sides here. I visited Istanbul in 2010 for 6 days,
Mm-hmm.
and then a few years on, lived there for 3 years. And I feel like I just didn't do a good enough job of seeing the city the first time around. So let me see if I can draw on 3 years of experience here and then sort of go through it day for day. Firstly, to start off, I think everyone needs to be looking at the Sultanate neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you say it colloquially, but it's named after the Sultan Ahmed. So it's literally Sultan Ahmed. That's where you're going to find a lot of those top sites. You have the Blue Mosque, also known as the Sultanate Mosque. You have Topkapi Palace, which is something that was built by the Sultans kind of right after they touched down in Istanbul or took Istanbul. The Grand Bazaar is also in the area, and that's something which I think you really want to be seeing.
Especially if you want to buy a carpet,
Yeah, definitely. Or if you want to practice your
or at
haggling
least be
skills.
sold a carpet.
I was about to say, I think you're giving too much agency to yourself in that. I think for the most part, it's people sort of coming at you. But if you have a little bit of Turkish to play with, it's a lot of fun to go there and sort of haggle. People are actually pretty kind, I find.
I think you are underselling them. You don't need to know Turkish. They will know whatever language you speak.
Yes, also a fair
I'm
point. Yeah,
quite impressed by how multilingual the carpet sellers in the Grand Bazaar are.
yeah. They know about 12% of every language, I feel. Yeah.
Yeah.
And with a smile, too. We should add
Oh,
that.
absolutely. We'll get into that a little more. I've got a great story, so go ahead.
Fantastic. So the final thing that I would really recommend in Sultanahmet is to see the Basilica Cistern. And that's something which I feel like some people, they spend a little too long at some of those other major sites and they just miss out on it. For me, the Basilica Cistern, I think, is the most impressive site that I saw as far as just being so different. And that's the cistern they stored water, which I believe supplied water up to Topkapi.
Not originally, no. So this is something that was built by the Byzantines, and the Turks didn't discover it till they had occupied the city for 100 years.
Okay.
This the layers upon layers of history in the city is it was built by, I think, by Justinian, but I wouldn't swear to that. So much of the city was built by Justinian
Fair.
or by Theodosius or somebody, but they built this cistern, which is architecturally interesting, right under Hagia Sophia or just close to Hagia Sophia, and
Across.
the Turks didn't know about it until they were trying to figure out why there were people who were fishing in their basement. They were basically casting fishing lines into the dark reaches and going, well, where are you getting fish from? And so they went down about 100 years later, as I understood, and discovered the Basilica Cistern. So it's a bizarre place. They do concerts down there as well because of the acoustics. Interesting place.
Yeah, surely. And if I'm not mistaken, they filmed, there's a scene from Russia with Love in there as well, in the Basilica Cistern. I think that, if I remember correctly, James Bond made an appearance there, some final scene. I haven't seen the scene, but that's what I've heard from Turkish friends.
And there's a more recent scene from one of the Dan Brown novels turned movies. So from, I think, the most recent one of those, whose name is Inferno, I think, has a scene in the Basilica Cistern as well.
It's worth a visit, obviously. When I was talking about those places, and you'll know if you've been there, I think probably you're going to want to take 2 days
Yeah, I can see that. Mm-hmm.
when you're there, because otherwise it just comes across as a bit rushed and a bit hectic. But I think at the same time, too, the big mistake that people make when they go to Istanbul is only visiting this neighborhood.
Right.
And you'll know as well as I will that there's a lot going on in the city, and it's a bit of a mistake just to stay there. But at the same time, it'd be a mistake not to do the area justice as well, because
Right.
there's a lot to see.
And I think you left off one significant building in that neighborhood.
Which would you?
Hagia Sophia. You didn't actually mention it.
I mentioned it offhandedly
you mentioned it at the beginning, yeah.
I feel like for me, just as spending 3 years in Istanbul, it's just like, I guess that's just something you just assume. But of course, yeah, it's incredible. And if you get a chance too, there's an incredible tulip festival that goes on in the spring, and they build in between the Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque. They build a literal carpet out of tulips, and it's really something to behold.
And I don't think a lot of people know that before the Dutch had tulips, the Turks had tulips.
Mm-hmm.
That this is more a Turkish flower than a Dutch flower, even.
Just to add on, all the parks in Istanbul in the spring are really participating in this. We're really showing off what they can do with tulips. And there's one park I would really recommend if you're there in the springtime called Emirgan Park. And it's in the Sarıyer district of Istanbul. That's a place to see tulips that would rival, I think, any show the Dutch could put on with tulips.
Okay. And before we get away from this neighborhood, let's go into a little more detail. So the Blue Mosque, for instance, tips we should know when we're visiting a mosque, assuming we're not Muslim.
Right. So it really depends on the mosque, but I think the important thing to remember is all these mosques, well, generally speaking, the mosques in Istanbul are still very much active in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. So when you're entering this mosque, you have to be respectful of the fact that people are going to be there praying.
Right.
That's obviously a very personal moment. As far as the pragmatic details, I think as a general rule, you want to be covered to show respect. And I think that would mean generally the rules are a little bit looser for males. So the main rules for females that I've seen really at the forefront are just you want to be wearing a shawl around your shoulders and covering your shoulders. And then your conduct inside it. The main thing is if someone's active in prayer in a mosque, you want to be careful of not being that tourist that's taking a picture of someone who's having a personal, intimate moment. So those sorts of things are things to keep in mind. And again, it's not like Turks are paying credence to a history that's long gone. 99% of the population or something like that still identifies as Muslim, and it's a big part of life there. So those sorts of things are worth noting.
Yeah, and I don't think generally you'll be let in during the calls to prayer. I think that's generally a time that's really there for Muslims. You'll take your shoes off and leave them in a little shoe bin and go in, and yeah, for women, cover the shoulders and the head. And for guys, this is not a place you're going to be wearing your wife beater t-shirts or things like that, but let's hope you're not wearing those on vacation anyway.
Or just at the time, but yeah.
Yeah, tank tops and things like that. This is not the place for it. A couple of interesting things historically about the Sultanahmet Mosque is Sultanahmet really thought that Hagia Sophia was so amazing architecturally, which it is. We're talking about a building that was the biggest building in the world for 1,000 years. And so he wanted something like that. So he said to his architect, who was up to the challenge. I mean, the Sultanahmet Mosque is an amazing building in its own right, and you can tell architecturally that it was influenced by Hagia Sophia. They look like they're cousins, if not twins. And then he did something very controversial, though, is he built 6 minarets around the building. And if you look in Istanbul, the more minarets at a mosque, the more significant the personage who built it. And so if you see something that has 4 minarets, it's probably built by a sultan. If you see something that has 1, it was probably a local mosque. And it just count the minarets, and it's interesting and tie that to the history. But he built one with 6, and the only other mosque in the world that had 6 was in Mecca.
I was going to say Mecca.
Oh, yeah. And so he got in a world of trouble because one is he'd never actually won any victories for Islam. It's like, who are you to think that you can build this? They really were calling for him to tear down one of the minarets. 5 is okay, 6 is too much. And so instead, as I understand the story, is he paid to build a 7th in Mecca, which I thought was a clever solution for that. But, I'm the head of the Ottoman Empire. We're going to have 6.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I was going to note, I think Hagia Sophia typically gets the nod as the sort of mosque in Istanbul, but
except it's no longer a mosque now, it's just a museum.
But the Sultanahmet Mosque, to me, it's more aesthetically pleasing.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Maybe that's controversial. When I look at
outside or inside?
Outside.
Okay.
The Hagia Sophia, the inside's been under pretty significant restoration for a fair bit of time. When I first visited in 2010, it's still under a lot of restoration. The Blue Mosque, for me, I think the inside's obviously it's a special place to be, but at the outside, obviously it was very carefully constructed. It's like, I think personally, it's probably the most aesthetically pleasing building on the planet for me.
Interesting. It is a beautiful building. I think they're both beautiful buildings. You're both beautiful children, but
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
and quite different in age, different by more than 1,000 years.
Both well worthy of the visit, obviously.
Okay.
You get a really nice view. There's a beautiful fountain in between those two mosques.
Mm-hmm.
Standing there, you get a pretty special view of both of them and sort of get to stand in the middle of history, right? And it's interesting. You literally just be looking at the Hagia Sophia and then turn around and compare and contrast rather easily with just a 180-degree turn. So it's nice.
Well, and the other thing that's interesting, you mentioned the Topkapi Palace. And there's more than one palace in Istanbul and from different time periods, and this is the oldest. So this is very, very Eastern. Very much rugs on the floor, not a lot of furniture.
Yeah.
Here's the haram kind of palace. Beautiful palace. We had a Turkish exchange student, and one of his friends was studying in English in Istanbul, and so he was taking me around and able to point out these are the Iznik tiles, which are these beautiful blue tiles from back before they forgot how to do that when the plague came through and things. And quite a significant building in terms of historically when it was built, and quite different than you might expect from other palaces you've been to if you've only been to palaces west of here.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you. The focus isn't really on, as you were mentioning about the tiles and that. In many cases, the way they're making the room elaborate and beautiful and intricate is really what they're doing on the walls, not what they're doing
Right.
in the center of the room. As you were saying, you go to a palace in the West and you expect sort of this chandeliers and gold-plated this and this, that, and the other. And I think...
And you can see that in Istanbul, just not here.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll get there.
Yeah. And actually, I think a big focus of the Topkapi Palace is what they've been able to collect and show in their collection.
Oh, yeah.
The museum there is something else. They have some pieces there that you just think, really? You've literally collected this sword or this weapon of, you're seeing people who kind of thought were in history books and legends, and they have their, whatever it might be, book, sword, whatever it is.
Tooth. Like there's a tooth from Muhammad there, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, there's also a sword there as well.
Yeah.
That they lay claim to the fact that Muhammad used it.
And then you had mentioned the Grand Bazaar, where we are absolutely going to be sold a carpet. Is that your favorite bazaar in Istanbul or even in this neighborhood?
It's a good question. Just the area itself. Like the Grand Bazaar is worth a visit, however.
Absolutely.
My parents came to visit me in Istanbul, and I'd been to the Grand Bazaar a lot of times. And I kind of said, well, and we'll go to the Grand Bazaar. And kind of it ended up being a real highlight for my parents because you see a lot of Turkish culture shining through. You see these really outgoing and exuberant shopkeepers who are sipping on a non-stop supply of chai.
A tea, yeah. The boys running through the market with trays of little glasses of tea.
Exactly, yeah. For me, I think it's the market you want to be going to, if only because it's intensely Turkish.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, they have everything there, and you can do a lot of haggling there. And for the most part, you're gonna leave there not being too ripped off, really, because there's a guy beside you who's listening carefully to how much the person's charging you, and they'll probably offer you less.
Well, that's why they get you back into your shop and sit you down and give you a cup of tea before they sell you the carpet. This is not the first show we've done in Istanbul. We did some, 10 years ago or something like that? It's been quite a long time. But if you listen to one of the shows we did in Istanbul, I was wearing a microphone when I walked into the Grand Bazaar. And so the whole experience of buying the carpet, I didn't buy a carpet. I didn't want to buy a carpet. But being sold a carpet and the whole conversation is recorded on that show. And this was two Kurdish brothers who spoke wonderful English, and we had just a wonderful conversation. I don't want to give you the impression this was a bad experience by any means. It was quite enjoyable, but listen to that show. But I would say in that neighborhood, my favorite bazaar is the Spice Bazaar, just as a photographer, yeah.
As you were speaking, I was just about to say it would also be a mistake not to go to the Spice Bazaar, which is within walking distance of the Grand Bazaar.
Well, this whole neighborhood is.
Exactly.
Distance, yeah.
And you're right, from a photographer's perspective, it's actually really quite set up for photographers, right? Because they have the stacks of spices which are made to look aesthetically pleasing for you, so you can line up a quick shot and throw it on low aperture and get something you can put on Instagram, I guess.
I was there before Instagram, though, so bummer. But, okay, excellent. Yeah, and then the only other thing I can think of that we've left off, the two different things There's actually a hippodrome, or the remains of a hippodrome, or the layout more than the building from the Justinian's time there. Remember, you're in the old capital of Rome, which we don't want to forget at the same time that we're talking about all of the Ottoman architecture and the Ottoman history here. And then also, I think, tell me if you got a better option here, that this is a great place to go to a cafe and get some Sultanahmet kofta.
I mean, the restaurants there, they're trying to show you what traditional Turkish fare.
Right.
I've had some great meals down there. Kofta is never a bad way to go.
Which is a meatball, just so people know. Or
it's as simple as a Turkish meatball, but they do a lot of things with sauces down there. Traditionally, you'd have, if you got the full meal, you'd probably have some pilav, so some rice that would be probably lightly oiled or buttered, and then you'd have the kofta, which would, the way I've seen it done in a traditional sense, is a little bit of tomato, a little bit of peppers, a light tomato sauce that's not really going to take away from the flavor of the meat, but more kind of add to it, and then probably a little.
And then there would be yogurt. There would always be yogurt. Yogurt to eat, yogurt to drink. There would always be yogurt.
It's incredible how much yogurt I ended up eating yogurt every day with things you wouldn't often think about eating yogurt with. You get into this pattern where, like, any meat dish, yogurt. Any bread dish, yogurt. It's a staple.
Well, and you mentioned the Turkish breakfast, which oddly enough includes yogurt. And I remember, shockingly, and then also lots and lots of olives was very different. What is a Turkish breakfast to you?
Firstly, I think it's my favorite single meal on the planet. Again, I have a bias here, but I've been lucky to travel a lot. I've yet to find a meal that I feel is as delicious and complete as Turkish breakfast. So firstly, I should stipulate that Turkish breakfast is great because the way you're eating is you're sharing it. You're sharing it with each other. All these dishes come and literally overwhelm your table, and you just try and keep up with the pace. As far as like some dishes you would want as part of your Turkish breakfast, and usually it comes as a set. So you'd pay pricier Turkish breakfast would be something like 25 lira, but it'd be very easy to get Turkish breakfast for 18, 20 lira. And when everybody chips in that amount, or you get, let's say, 4 breakfasts for a table of 5, your table just gets overwhelmed. So menemen is a real staple, and menemen is literally egg and tomato just cooked together in a perfect little mix with some oil. You've got, again, the olives.
Of all kinds, yeah. If there aren't 12 types of olives, they're really shirking.
Yeah, exactly. And they're often like herbed and...
absolutely, yeah. Garlic.
You'll know that there's, in Turkey itself, there's a bit of a tension there with who started things first.
No, there is no tension at all. Turkey started everything.
Okay, yeah. So
Turkey makes the best baklava. Turkey invented baklava, which isn't actually true, but they did perfect it. I will absolutely give them that. So,
not lying. You've definitely been to Turkey, because if you
Turkish exchange student, we had this conversation every day.
Yeah. Okay, so I actually do think they have the best olives in the world, but they do too.
It is defensible, yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of a Turkish-style sesame bagel. You'd want to make sure you have beyaz peynir, which...
You mentioned simit, and then we went away from that, and that's one I want to put a pin in, because I love simit.
Yeah, and so simit can be done a number of ways, but typically the best way I could describe it would be really a Turkish-style sesame-encrusted bagel that's, if it's done right, is really nice and hard on the outside and crunchy, but perfectly tender on the inside. And you would often buy it with cheese with it, or Nutella or something like that. But
no, you just eat that plain.
Or just plain, yeah. I mean, you'd be very hard pressed to walk a block in Istanbul without seeing
a simit vendor. Yeah, there are circular rings about 10 inches in diameter, roughly.
Give or take, yeah.
Yeah. As you're walking down Istanbul, part of the smell of the city is the simit.
The city literally runs on simit and chai. It's constantly, that's the city's fuel, in my opinion.
Excellent. So we've only done one neighborhood, and we're about 30 minutes into this. This is going to be our problem. What else should we see in Istanbul?
Right. So if you've spent your day 1 and 2 in Sultanahmet and you've seen those great sites, you have to make sure you get to across the Galata Bridge and to neighborhoods like Taksim and Galata. Taksim is changing quite a bit. It used to be a long tree-lined pedestrian boulevard.
Istiklal Caddesi.
Exactly, Istiklal Caddesi, which is you would say is the pedestrian boulevard
Yes.
in Istanbul.
Where the old European embassies used to be.
Exactly. And some still are. You still have the Russian embassy, if I'm not incorrect,
Okay.
and the Dutch embassy. It is also known as a bit of a area as a nightlife hub.
Yes.
From a tourist perspective, I would probably take the metro to Taksim and then walk from Taksim just literally straight all the way down to Istiklal Caddesi, and you'll get to the bottom to Shishane station. And if you go just to the left down there to a narrow street, that'll lead you right to the Galata Tower.
Okay.
And the Galata Tower is well worth seeing. And also going up offers you views of the city that are pretty special. And the Galata Tower has got an interesting history as well.
Built by the Portuguese with permission by the Ottomans, if I remember correctly.
I was going to say, I believe it was the Genoese.
Oh, it could be. It could be.
If I'm not incorrect, it was originally called the Jesus Tower.
Oh, interesting.
I'll have to double check on that.
Well, you were right about the Genoese. I'll give you that.
If I'm not incorrect, the Genoese had a place there they were sort of protecting around the time of the Crusades.
The Tower of Christ in Latin. You are correct.
Yeah.
Christe Turis.
Yeah. If I was doing that on my third day, I would carefully walk down there and check out some of the shops there. But then I would make sure I got up to a rooftop bar.
Okay.
It doesn't matter if you drink or don't. You can go up there and have a tea. It doesn't matter. It's really all about the view itself. I could recommend a few rooftop bars, which are all in a walking distance around there. The one that's really quite expensive, but you've got the most stunning views, I would say, of any rooftop in the city, is in the area of Pera, which is, again, a walk, and it's known as Mikla. Also in Pera is an old hotel with a great rooftop called Büyük Londra, which really means the Big London Hotel. Finally, there's one that's sort of less expensive, and it's called Balkon, Balkon. So if you're in that area and you're walking down the street and you still have some energy left in the tank, if it wasn't a 40-degree summer day and you have some energy left, I would recommend one of those three places for a pretty unstoppable view.
Well, and that begs the question. I was there in February, which is a little chilly. It wasn't bad weather. You're talking about the real heat of the summer. When's the best time to go to Istanbul from a weather point of view or festival point of view?
It's got to be spring or fall. The winter time is it's not particularly cold, but it's pretty gray and a little bit dismal. The one thing I'll say that's really nice about the spring is that's when the tulips are coming in and the city just really bursts to life again. Streets fill up with people and there's just an unmistakable energy. So when I'm talking about the spring, I would say you'd be fine. April, May, and even probably the early parts of June are all going to be pretty nice. But as of April, you start to get a really nice sun coming in. I would also say on the tail end of that, late September, October, also nice, even mid-September.
Even February wasn't bad when I was there. It was chillier, but it really wasn't that bad in terms of weather.
I would actually say that the only time I would really recommend not coming, or at least coming prepared, would be the summertime. July and August are extremely hot.
Okay.
You either want to come knowing it's going to be that hot with sunscreen and a big water bottle, or avoid it. But it's also busy in the summertime too. So that's what I would say. I love Istanbul in the spring, and that's largely because I'm Canadian.
So the weather's never too cold in Istanbul then, basically.
Right. Oh, no, never. And also it was always fun. I had friends back home. I was out to shorts and a t-shirt in April and May, and they're still considering whether to put the winter jacket to rest.
Right. You mentioned some rooftop bars in Galata and that region. What's the name of that neighborhood?
Beyoğlu, but you have Taksim and Galata and Pera in there.
But the other one that I would suggest, not a rooftop bar, but a hilltop tea bar, would be Pierre Loti Cafe, which is on the other side of the Golden Horn. The Golden Horn, the water that separates these two neighborhoods that we're talking about, and you can go look down on the Galata Tower and Beyoğlu.
Yeah, I just also, that sort of sparked something for me as well. There is a restaurant also in Sultanahmet that is a very nice rooftop cafe, really. It's called Seven Hills.
Okay.
And you can go up to the top of there. So that's rather nice if you have a long day in Sultanahmet and you see the Hagia Sophia and you're a bit tired out and you want to take a little break. Going up there to get a tea is a nice little break.
Cool. We probably need to accelerate our pace. There's so much left to cover. What else would you recommend?
I would say day 4 for you would be a walk along the Bosphorus.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of neighborhoods which are really great down there. I would personally start my day in Bebek. Bebek is kind of all the way down the coast. You got beautiful views of the Bosphorus. I would start my day there and eat Turkish breakfast at a great place called Nezi. You need to plan for half an hour after that meal just to recover because they really bring out the food in droves. But luckily, if you do follow this plan, you'll have a long walk ahead of you. So I would personally walk all the way down from Bebek along the water and see the fishermen, and you'll arrive next just by walking along the coast in a neighborhood called Arnavutköy. Arnavutköy, in my opinion, is really an up-and-coming neighborhood in Istanbul, a historic neighborhood, but it's really getting back on the tourist map. You have narrow houses, the old sort of Ottoman wooden facades to the house that are really classic.
And I'm not quite sure where you are. You're still on the European side?
Right. So we're still on the European side. You're up towards the Bosphorus Bridge.
Near Ortaköy or?
Exactly. So actually, these neighborhoods are all in sequence. So you would go Bebek all the way to Arnavutköy, and then from Arnavutköy, the walk again another 25 minutes, and you'll end up in Ortaköy.
Okay.
And that's where the Ortaköy Mosque is, which is
the picture you see of Istanbul everywhere, of the bridge and the mosque in front of it, is Ortaköy. Beautiful place. Little tiny square.
So I would definitely go to the Ortaköy Mosque. If you had time left, if you hadn't moseyed around, you could head on up to Beşiktaş as well.
Okay.
There's a restaurant there, a little bit pricey, but I would say sort of a top 3 view in the city. It's called Vogue. I would say is really worth taking a drink up there and admiring the view. So that would be day 4.
Now, when you get to Beşiktaş, you're right near the Dolmabahce Palace also then.
Yep.
Which we should at least give a nod to. That's the other palace we were referring to that is the more European style, built in the 1800s with a lot of borrowed cash that they couldn't afford.
Yeah.
So the most significant historical thing there is that Ataturk, the father of the Turkish nation, Gazi Mustafa Kemal Pasha, if I remember correctly, and I'm doing this from memory, his deathbed is there. And so you'll see pictures of that, a significant place in Turkish history.
Yeah, literally Ataturk translates to kind of the
father of the Turk. Yeah.
Yeah, and he is a revered figure and a very interesting historical figure, and
very politically interesting now.
Yeah.
But I'm going to push that off just a little longer.
Sure, and I will say your note about it being more European style is obviously a bit of a reflection of Ataturk was trying to found a secular republic with what that was looking west in some way. So he put some finishing touches on things to make them more Western.
And if you want to be glad that you can actually read the Turkish signs, thank Ataturk, because one of the things he did is he went away from the Arabic script to Latin script with a few curls and things like that, a few accent cds, so you can tell when your C is a CH or your S is an SH. And Turkish is actually one of the languages I can spell in better than English because they really have only been spelling that way since the 1920s, 1930s. And so it hasn't drifted as much.
I've rarely seen a figure that's more revered in a country than Ataturk is for Turkey. Very interesting figure historically. If you're looking for something a bit different, I personally would take that 5th day and I would check out the Princess Islands.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Because one thing you need to do in Istanbul is get out on the water and see the city looking towards it from the water. If you're going out to the Princess Islands, you can catch a ferry from either Kabataş or Beşiktaş. And there's a collection of 9 islands, 4 of which are more developed. The 4 islands which are more on the map would be Büyükada, Heybeliada, Burgazada, and this is the one I always have problems pronouncing, Kınalıada. Yeah, my personal opinion would be check out Heybeliada, which I believe is the 2nd largest island, and I think it's really quaint and a lovely place to just walk around for an afternoon. If I'm not incorrect, I'm not positive about the history here, but I understood from friends that they were called the Princess Islands because during early Ottoman times, I think they were putting princes out on the islands.
Causing trouble.
Well, yeah, and from being within striking distance of the Sultanate. Yeah, there have been some notable residents there over the years, that's for sure.
Okay, where to next?
If that's your fifth day and you've got a good tan now, I think the sixth day I would take to go to Balat, which is the classic idea of narrow streets, and it's the traditional Jewish quarter. That is a place, it's not on the tourist map, and it really should.
I don't know where it is. Yeah, you definitely got me there.
And then near Balat is the Chora Church, which is
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
a medieval Greek Orthodox church with some murals that are extremely well preserved. Those two together will give you a picture of Istanbul you're probably not going to find. If there was a top 10 list in Lonely Planet, I just don't imagine Balat's on there. And teaming that up with the Chora Church would make for a nice day.
Well, and that is possibly my favorite site in Istanbul, Saint Savior on Kora,
Yeah,
or Chora, depending on your pronunciation there. It's amazingly well preserved. I mean, if you're in Hagia Sophia, there's a lot of well preserved murals because so many of these were plastered over when it became a mosque. But even more so in this tiny, accessible church, the murals as well as the frescoes.
I've seen a lot of mosaics and frescoes and things, and the colors that are bursting out of those frescoes are something else. It's a special place to go. And oh, I should add, right near the Chora Church, you have the old Byzantine walls, and you can take a walk on those as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're there, you really ought to go out to the walls of Theodosius. So built in the 400s. They've been refurnished, but basically they were unbreached until the 1400s when they were conquered by Mehmet the Conqueror, when they basically came in with the aid of cannon.
Yeah.
What finally did in Istanbul. Yeah, fascinating to go walk on the walls there. The other thing I would say, you mentioned going out on the water, which I completely agree is a good idea. But if you go to the southern end of the wall and you look out at all of the shipping that comes into Istanbul, I've never seen so many big ships in, I think, any place I've been. And you see what a amazing, interesting commercial place this is because of the routes up to the Black Sea. And you realize why this was fought over for so many years. Basically, it is a very strategic location.
Yeah, absolutely. The Bosphorus Strait, I have a hard time thinking about a more strategic location because there are a lot of people who rely on that trade route pretty heavily. I've honestly never seen the Bosphorus quiet. It's always large scale shipping. Well, I'll go over my day 7, and this is what I would do if I had the week.
Okay.
I think you'd be pretty remiss to come to Istanbul and not step foot in Asia. So I would take day 7 and I would go to the Asian side. You can hop a ferry very easily from both Kabataş and Beşiktaş, and ferry is about 30 minutes. As you're aboard the ferry, people are coming around selling tea, and it's an experience unto itself. It's not like a transportation you wouldn't want to take. It's actually part of the tourist experience. And you get over to Kadıköy, and honestly, I would just recommend just walking around. A lot of that neighborhood is very liberal and very hip, and they've got a whole street of really interesting bars and restaurants. Just spending a few hours walking around that neighborhood, I think, will give you pretty good insight into what's life could be like for an average young liberal Istanbulite. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on there, museums and things as well. But that's what I would do. I would go over to Kadıköy, and it's never a bad idea to just go and drink heaps of tea in a whole bunch of different places in the neighborhood.
Okay, absolutely.
And this is one of those neighborhoods.
Well, it's interesting that you say it's more liberal because when we went over to the Asian side, I remember it being more, at least the neighborhoods we went to, being more traditional, more conservative, more women in more layers and more veils, where on the Western side and the European side, quite often seeing women in European dress. You'll see both in Istanbul. It is a collection.
You're right about that, actually, but Kadıköy is that
exception.
Exactly, in a pretty big way. They're a neighborhood with, if they're not pleased about something that's going on in the nation, they're usually the first ones to be up in arms about change in office or what have you. It would not be unusual for Kadıköy to be the first one to sort of set off a trend, so to speak.
Well, and before we get into that, I think we're just about to the politics and the perhaps some things you need to know before you get there in that things. Anything else you would want to mention in terms of things to do or see before we talk about why I had some reservations doing this show? What else should we see?
I mean, I think the overview I've given, I think, covers a lot of it, but there's a few other neighborhoods. Perhaps I would recommend Karaköy, not Kadıköy. Karaköy is a very interesting neighborhood right by the water. It's just beside Galata as you're walking towards the Galata Bridge. And Karakoy is a really cool neighborhood. They have this famous street which has all these colorful umbrellas, and it's rather photogenic. Bomonti is a really up and coming neighborhood. They converted an old brewery into this really interesting cultural space. Istanbul is not particularly known for its beer, but that's a cool space where they're celebrating the heritage of Bomonti, which is one of the old breweries. I'm sure Istanbul is one of those cities where I'm going to
Leave something out. Oh, there's just no.
Oh, I'm just going to. Lastly, Cihangir. This is Cihangir's the neighborhood, which is very much like where you would think of the artists hanging out, and a lot of history there around writing and poetry and authors and things like that in Cihangir, and great cafe culture in Cihangir as well, sort of secondhand stores and things like that. And finally, if you have extra time, Nişantaşı is a sort of like a posh neighborhood. It's not a picture people have in their mind when they think about Istanbul from their couch. So again, just offer as many counterpoints as you can for a city which is pretty complicated and interesting.
The only thing I would add to that is when we were in Ortaköy, that's not a bad place to think about cruise up the Bosphorus. If you're a history buff, I think cruising up to the Fortress Europe and Fortress Asia, which are the two forts that were built in the 1400s by Mehmed the Conqueror on the European side and by his father on the Asian side. That's a beautiful cruise, just to even seeing all of the old houses and palaces and things like that along the Bosphorus there is quite interesting. Let's talk about why I was hesitating doing this show, which is Turkey has been going through some political changes. Let's put it that way easily. I'm not all that thrilled with some of the changes that are going on in Turkey, as I'm not all that thrilled with some of the changes going on in the United States. And of course, my opinion matters more in the United States than it does in Turkey. But what do we need to know as a traveler about the area? You were there in the middle of this.
Well, you're right. It's a country that's going through great change. I would say first step that things have indeed stabilized. There were moments last December and January where if you were following the news, you were seeing headlines about Istanbul all the time. And that was a difficult time to be there. The truth of the matter is that now you're somebody who's firmly at the helm of the country. And
I'm going to go as far as saying more authoritarian, just so you know.
Again, it's a complicated issue, and I don't want to speak like I have all the answers. But basically, we were talking before about Ataturk, and he founded the country very much looking to the West on secular values. And he was really big about making sure that education and all facets of life in Turkey would be separated from religion. And now you're seeing a leader who's aiming to put that back into society in big ways.
Well, and this is very unusual and hard for us to understand, is he sort of put it in the culture, if not the constitution, that if it ever went too much religious, that the army would step in.
Right.
And have a coup, basically, which is hard for us to imagine that as well. And so you need to put the coup that we saw somewhat in that context, too. That wasn't necessarily unexpected or even in some ways unlawful, although it was clearly because it failed. But an unusual place. It'd be very different in other places if, when you talk about coup, it's a little more complicated in Turkey.
A lot of those events which have unfolded in Istanbul over the past 3 years are very much up for debate.
Yes.
A lot of people wonder about the legitimacy of anything from votes.
And I honestly don't know.
I would say, as far as practical advice for travelers, it is one thing that you want to be careful about speculating on
publicly.
The current regime is watching carefully about the things that are being said about them. I know from living there that certain people who liberally, publicly spoke their mind ended up running into some trouble. It's a nation right now where if you're visiting, you want to be learning as much as you can about the country, but I would be careful about forming opinions too quickly and then expressing those publicly while you're still in the country, to be honest with you.
Any other warnings you would have unrelated to politics about going to Istanbul that you really should know something?
Two things, actually. It's a city which on paper has 14 million people, but in reality, I think most people who live there would make the claim that there's a lot of undocumented people in Istanbul, and it's probably something closer to 20 million in reality. And in lieu of that, two things to remember. Personal space is going to look a little bit different. It's not unusual to be walking on a busy day in Istanbul and there for literally to be a human current in one direction. You're either going with it or against it. So personal space is going to look a bit different. The other thing too is with that many people, you're also going to have a fair bit of traffic.
Sure. Yeah.
Taking the metro as much as you can. Ubers and taxis are pretty cheap. I would never take an Uber or a taxi around rush hour or anything like that. You're better just to take the metro or the tram line. I mean, other than that, I've always seen that people have come to Istanbul, they had an idea of what it was, and then they leave and being like, oh, I was way off the mark. I didn't know there was this much diversity in this city. So I think I would also go with an open mind and try and check your preconceived notions and have them be challenged.
I would also say it's a city that it would be an advantage to do some day tours, even if you're traveling independently, unless you have much more depth of history than I have. I really benefited by having a informal tour guide who knew more about things than I did. And you're talking about a city with so much history and so many layers that this would be a great place to get on a walking tour or something like that. Explain some things.
And contextualize things. And one final thing I would say is flights are incredibly cheap, both in Turkey and elsewhere, which was great for me being able to travel around. But I would say that it's really not out of the realm of possibility to hop a quick flight down to Cappadocia and get on a hot air balloon or go to Izmir or Bodrum or Kaş or Trabzon. Any of these places, it's really inexpensive. So I would say before you throw out that idea of not being able to go somewhere else other than Istanbul, I'd take a peek at the flights because they're really competitive.
Excellent. Well, and we're not going to get into those places because we're already at a very long show. To wrap this up, you're standing in the prettiest spot in all of Istanbul. Where are you standing? What are you looking at?
For me, I think I have to go back to a place that I mentioned offhandedly before. You're standing at that fountain in between Sultanahmet Mosque, or the Blue Mosque, and the Hagia Sophia, especially a spring day, and they've got the fountains going. I think it's one of the prettiest places on the planet, let alone Istanbul. I honestly, being back in Toronto now, thinking about those sort of memories, it's all you can do just to not break out in a big smile, just thinking about standing there.
Excellent. I would give a nod to Ortaköy as well, there by the Bosphorus Bridge. Excellent. And one thing that makes you laugh and say only in Istanbul.
I actually love walking. Usually you're taking the tram across the Galata Bridge.
Yep.
Walking across the Galata Bridge. Yeah. The fishermen, but not even just them fishing. It's just that you walk by, there's like small groups that they're just hanging out every day, and they always seem to have simit, and they're having a cigarette, and there's always laughter, and there's tea and everything like that. So that's definitely like an only in Istanbul sort of thing. And also the enormous amount of gorgeous stray cats.
Oh.
I actually ended up bringing one home with me back to Toronto. Stray cat, a kitten who showed up at my door. If you go around, especially neighborhoods like Cihangir, they have cat houses and the neighborhoods take care of them.
Huh.
And there's a real community effort there. Actually, I would take that moment to give a shout out to, there's a documentary made about the Istanbul street cats called Kedi, which means cat in Turkish, Kedi, and it's a very good documentary. So something to watch out for.
Excellent. And if you had to summarize Istanbul in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Bold. I think it's a very unapologetic city. People there are truly themselves in the city, and the city wears its colors with pride. I would say it's complex. It's a city that I spent 3 years in, and I feel like I have a good understanding of it, but you could spend a lifetime and still be marveling at everything that's going on around you. And finally, I would say it's maybe awe-inspiring. There are a lot of moments, like I've rarely been to a city where I feel like I've had more profound moments, where you're looking at something and you just think, even again, I visited some sites 4, 5, 6, 7 times, whatever, and it never really lost its charm. And that's, if I went back tomorrow, I would have more to do on my itinerary. So that's something special.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Christopher Mitchel. And where can we read more about your travels?
TravelingMitch.com. That's where I'm writing frequently. At Traveling Mitch on Instagram and at Traveling Mitch on Twitter as well. Those 3 channels, you should be figuring out what I'm up to and where I am in the world.
And if we were looking for your best article on Istanbul, what would that one be?
I would just go to my site, go to the search bar in the top right and type in Istanbul and make that decision for yourself, because I've written about a lot of different places and a lot of different angles. And I think just depending on who you are, you'll find that one post might suit you better. But there's plenty of content on Turkey and Istanbul on the site naturally.
Excellent. And thanks again for coming on The Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for Istanbul and letting me talk about mine too.
It was great to rehash those experiences with you. So thanks so much for having me on.
If you listen to this show when it first comes out, I'll be on a plane to London, as I mentioned on last week's show. If you want to catch up, then go to the Facebook group, facebook.com/amateurtraveler, and we'll coordinate a potential meetup in London. I had 3 new iTunes reviews for the show, and those really do help the show, so my thanks to the 3 people who put in reviews. The first one, a must listen when travel planning. I turn to this podcast every time I plan a trip. The host is knowledgeable and kind. Keep up the good work. Number 2, love, love, love. I love listening to this podcast. I love traveling vicariously through his and contributors, especially the lesser-known places. Great job. And the third one, great show. Highly recommend. Chris and his guests share inspiring and actionable insights and tips on everything you need to know when it comes to travel. Highly recommend listening and subscribing if you have the desire to travel and want to learn how best to do it and where to go. So my thanks to Stiffa and Jay Timmer and Eric Bison. And again, reviews of the show are appreciated. That's how a lot of people discover it. That and word of mouth. Tell your friends. I just sent off the order for the trip t-shirts for India. That's coming soon, so I'm looking forward to traveling with some of you. And again, if you're interested in joining us for next year or the year after, go to amateurtraveler.com/trips and join the Facebook group. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.